Now, I normally don't do, excuse me, such, in quotes, intellectual lecture because I'm pretty much straight up and out it shoots from my mouth. So I'm going to sit down and read from my notes, which I have refined and refined so I don't put you to sleep, and try to give you an overall view of myself as an artist and as a quilt maker. At 20 years of age, I became a potter, studying ceramics as an undergraduate at Ohio State University. Throwing on the wheel for months on end, I began to learn my first valuable lesson, which is the figure must be beautifully formed against the ground. My work was spare as an undergraduate. At age 22, I was accepted into the 3-year MFA program at Ohio State University. I began working with slabs of clay, hand-building pots with positive-negative patterning. As my minor, I hand-appliqued cotton layers with positive-negative imagery, always trying to hone greater figure-ground relationships. Also at a time when I was told that this was absolutely unacceptable in art school. And I began to learn to weave. Note, there are the very motifs later used in my quilts. As I said, I was always and am still very strong-minded and to some extent a risk-taker. In 1969, when it came time for my final MFA exhibition, I took a stand in defense of my very large body of work. Up until that time at Ohio State University, all MFA candidates had only the use of the front hallways in the Fine Arts Building for their exhibition. But I said no. I said that I wanted my work in the gallery, and only in the gallery, and I won. I'm sure when you look at how I had to install my pieces, you can see that I was pretty financially broke at the time. Sketches for a small weaving. After graduate school, I started doing custom leather work. I needed a way to earn additional income as a young wife and mother of 2 young boys. I always tried to figure out a way to earn money to pay for my studio. I needed the income to pay for art supplies, and I was trying to save towards building an official studio. I sold at craft fairs. I'm sure many of you have been through this little charade, until one day I realized I hated hearing all the comments, and I quit. I made a promise to myself I was not going to do this past age 40. The important point in the lesson was to understand instinctively that I could not and would not ever compromise my real art by making it to sell. Part 2, quilts sold for cheap. This was my King's X, one of my earliest quilts from 1975. The magical price during that period of time in my life was $400. Most of the quilts from that period of time were 96 inches by 96 inches, and one by one I sold them off for $400. Most of these pieces had been hand quilted in a quilting bee, and the going price, hold on to your hats, at that time was $15 to do a big quilt. Oh my gosh. This was a quilt that actually never was exhibited from the time it was finished. A woman in New York City purchased it for $400, and I have no record of where it is to this day because I didn't keep good records. But it was intensely quilted, as you can see. And then I did a very complex piece, 96 by 96. Again, never exhibited, but I was desperate for money and sold it for $400. Focus. And incredibly finely quilted. And then came crosses. Was also part of this group of huge quilts. It did sell for more than $400. And the last one from this series of big pieces actually was purchased by the Renwick for $28,000. My philosophy is and has been prices increase but never decrease. Buy it now because it will be more expensive next year. During the 1970s, when I was in my early 30s, I received a lot of very important emotional support. In this photo, I am sitting next to my mother, and my sister Ann is sitting on the other side of my mother. She's 20 years older than I am, and from as early as I can remember, she always encouraged me and told me, Nancy, just keep practicing. You know you're going to get better if you just keep practicing. Another sister sent me cards with beautiful figure ground compositions. I sent cards and postcards back to her, and she would do oil paintings, including our cards in the oil paintings. She was a tough critic as regards composition, and I listened to what she had to say. I also looked for other great figure ground compositions, such as this of Father and Son by the great painter Mary Cassatt, of her brother and nephew. I love the way their clothing combined into an incredible abstract configuration. In 1979, Paul Smith, the director of the American Craft Museum in New York City, chose to hang my quilt high in the front window of the museum. This is the year that my career took off. Standing there in front, I'm surrounded or next to Judy, James, and Trevor under the umbrella. Later, Paul Smith included pieces from my Bittersweet series in an exhibition about patterning. Bittersweet 14 and Bittersweet 20 from a series of 24 quilts. Part 3. Edward Vouillard. Born 1868 in France, lived most of his life in Paris. Self-portrait in a mirror. Vouillard was extremely sensitive to and to others. Timid, cautious, self-effacing, and naturally serious. In appearance, he was a short, fine-boned man with red hair and full beard. Portrait of his mother, Marie. Marie Vouillard owned a corset-making shop in Paris and raised Edward and his sister as a single mother after the death of their father. Although his mother was a formidable person, he was extremely close to her, and she in turn was compassionate and steadfast in encouraging his artistic leanings. The seamstress. Vouillard has always been considered an intimist, not only because he preferred to paint small-scale pictures, but also because he concentrated on evocative depictions of family and friends in familiar surroundings. Almost without exception, he chose interiors as the setting for the intimate subjects so close to his heart. In other words, what he knew was what he painted. Madame Vouillard's sewing. The central character in many of his small paintings is his mother, whom he called his muse. His paintings pay homage to her and to her profession. They are lyrical tributes to the subject of women at work. What I love in this work, from this very young period in his life, again, is how he took the figures and the patterns and combined them into abstract configurations. This was titled Mother and Sister. These, by the way, are all very tiny, on the order of 12 inches by 15 inches. They're all done in oil. And then this beautiful piece called Interior. His paintings offer claustrophobic glimpses into an intimate life. He grew up to be obsessed by the microcosm of the world around him. Family life, confined within these ever-present walls, arouse powerful emotions, complex, claustrophobic, theatrical. This is probably my favorite painting of his, which depicts his mother and his sister. And within this very tiny painting, you clearly understand how strong a personality the mother was, as his sister rather disappears into the wallpaper. Woman in Blue, Woman Sweeping, Annette's Lunch. When you consider that these pieces were done in the late 1800s, they are so timely. There is nothing dated looking about them. Mother and Child, Woman in a Striped Dress. These paintings created between the ages of 20 and 32 are considered to be his most innovative and original. They were painted from his center, from his most intimate life experiences. In these small paintings, he addressed the relationships between form and color and their power to convey meaning independent of what they depict. After the age of 32, most of his work was outside of his center because most of his work were commissions. Part 4, Emily Kinwari, born in 1910, died in 1996. Moving to the other end of the age spectrum, I have chosen to show you 7 paintings by a famous Australian Aboriginal woman, Emily Kinwari. Emily began painting on canvas at age 79 and died 7 years later at age 86. There are many books published about her work. She is widely considered to be one of the finest Aboriginal artists of the late 20th century. Her painting subject matter that you see in front of you is based in body designs and dreaming sites associated with yam tubers and flowers. She uses polymer on canvas sitting on the ground and scooting around the edge of the canvas, never standing at an easel. To me, these are absolutely some of the most beautiful figure ground drawings. This is actually of a yam tuber. Likewise, this one also. Her work is large, yes. I'm sorry I don't have I have these in centimeters. 150 centimeters by 491 centimeters, but I don't know what that is in inches. Michael's saying about 60 inches across? Okay. I threw this painting in by Brice Martin because, you know, at least in my teaching, students are always bringing up the subject of what's derivative. Well, here we have Brice Martin in the United States doing his huge series of paintings with the same kind of motifs as Emily. And I assume that neither saw either one. Neither saw the work of either one. This is also the work of Emily. Her work got very complex. These were done when she was 85 years old. She is extremely arthritic and had to be helped down to the ground and also picked up from the ground in order to get the paintings done. Part 5. These are paintings that relate to those of Emily, done by my nephew Peter Crow when he was only 36 years old. I know that he never knew the work of Emily. I'm showing you these pieces, these 8 paintings, and reading a statement that he felt about this work at the time. They are all gouache, and they are approximately 30 inches across and 44 inches tall. He says, "To me, play is an experiment without hypothesis, and that is what these dried kelp constructions are about. I found the dried kelp on a beach in the San Juan Islands. I was amazed that these natural objects looked exactly like the gestural movements in my paintings. When I picked them up, their shadows cast loose, linear drawings on the beach. I began to play with them in my studio. I put them together, took them apart, combined them into extraordinary arrangements. Questions started to come up such as, what happens if their edges touch or overlap? What does it mean to have a little or a lot of space between each shape? What relationships do they have to each other? I look at these constructions in an open, non-judgmental way. It concerns me that I have given up on my ability to play and have therefore lost some of the cutting edge of my creativity." And I hasten and hatefully have to tell you that after doing this work, he was so discouraged he destroyed all of this. Part 6, a sampling of my own work starting from 1995. For the past 13 years, I have been most concerned with the process of eliminating and finding the essence, finding the truth in my own work through observation, imagination, and revelation. 1995 was a pivotal year, as it was the year I made my first quilt, the one that you see in front of you, titled Constructions. From this first composition, I discovered the seeds for 6 or more different series within the larger series of constructions. I will show you most of the quilts in sequence rather than groups so you can see how my mind works. My mind goes back and forth laterally. I have no ability to stay linear. I get bored very easily. As far as this group of quilts are concerned, I have to admit I love most of them, although I admit there are some that are not so wonderful. Again, in this very first quilt that I just showed you were all the ideas that I've sort of explored in the constructions. So the first 13 quilts that I did, you will see that they're closely related. The biggest challenge when I started was to dye up a new palette of colors that I hadn't worked with before. I'm not going to give you titles, I'm just going to flip through these. The bulk of them have been hand quilted by Marla Hadaball. In this series, I started making these very tall vertical pieces for the first time. So throughout the construction series, there are a number of these tall vertical pieces. I would say that with the construction series, I started to realize there are certain sizes that I like working with, and I tend to make those sizes almost naturally without realizing it. By the time I got to this one, as you can see, I was bored, and it looks boring. So what I did next was I started making small studies, trying to find my footing, trying to figure out where I wanted to go with my work. And so the next number of quilts don't really relate to one another. They're very disparate. So I went from complex to very spare. And then I tried picking up commercial prints again and found that I hated working with them. Reference to what I love in nature, trees, and decided to try cutting more linear type elements and work with those. But at the time managed to do only this one piece. Then went back to what I call layering and overlayering and cutting through. Didn't pick up on this again, let it go of it. I did this deliberately, turned it sideways so you could see how it has influenced the next piece. So all of these were ideas that I was trying out. And when I did this piece, I loved this piece. It's a small piece, relates to the radiator on a tractor. Worked with horizontals. Grids, and I don't know what you call this. I love this piece. This piece is absolutely encrusted with quilting by Marla.
anywhere from a 1/8 to a 1/4 inch grid. Went back and picked up on that earlier motif and realized I didn't want to do that anymore. And then, so you can see my brain was just flitting here, there, trying this, trying that. Back to the grid. Until finally when I did this piece, I thought, oh boy, I love this piece. This is probably one of my all-time favorites. And to me, it is just the beginning of ideas that I want to explore. This is all machine pieced. I am a machine piecer. I didn't even bother to say that. And it's just probably one of the most complex pieces I've ever done. This is actually, going back to the vertical lines again, a more contemporary version of Lady of Guadalupe. And one time I saw this tree bark, actually in South Africa, and realized that it was influencing me on another tall, narrow, vertical piece. Changed over to a really dark palette there for a while and stayed with blues and browns and blacks and grays. Back to a tall, very tall piece. It's almost 100 inches tall. So you can see that I'm flirting back and forth between very spare configurations. Trying to concentrate on the idea of line in a more classical way, more like a painting. And then I started to play with horizontal lines. And rather than strip piecing this, I actually cut every single piece by piece and sewed it together. This was a really time-intensive quilt. I had just come back from another trip to Mexico and seen the hats the dancers were wearing in one of the processions, and so I strip pieced up a lot of fabrics that looked like the ribbons on the hats and did this little study, and then did a major piece based on that little study. The detail of that one. These are all very large pieces, approximately 85 inches by 85 inches. I'm coming up now to the end of about 2004. Part 7 is just very short, and it's my attempt to show you that photography, the use of photography was always and has been a way for me to hone my eye for composition. This is actually on my farm. Again, the vertical lines of trees. In Chiapas, the vertical lines of a fence. How it relates to my strip piecing. And that quilt that I told you I had cut all the little pieces behind, one by one. Again, a fence. And then in this picture you see the horizontal line work. So these are the kinds of things I'm always looking at. This is what informs my own work. Architecture, constructions, whether they're man-made or they appear naturally. Vertical shapes. And then a few more of what they call the ghost tree, the eucalyptus tree in Australia. Part 8 is about Rosalie Gaskin. My photographs that I have, I've taken them from a catalog on her work. When I was teaching in Australia in 1999, I called and asked if I could meet her, not realizing that she had been diagnosed with cancer in the weeks before and was dying. In this photograph, she's age 81. She was born in 1917 in a suburb of Auckland, New Zealand, left New Zealand for Australia with her new husband when she was 25 years old, and where she quickly bore 3 children. As a young mother, she often took long walks, observing the landscape, training her eye. She states, this is a beautiful comment from her. Through that sort of poverty with things, your eye gets very sharp. She'd take home anything that interested her, especially native Australian plants, and became an expert in preserving flowers and grasses. It was very gradual. I had to bring things into my house to look at. I had a lot of scorn from the neighbors, saying, "What's that?" They liked things they paid money for. This didn't worry me then. I had to have things that I found interesting. There wasn't any stimulation of the eye. You fed your eye as much as you could, and I think that's why I started. I was so hungry for something extra and not the ordinary turnover of the everyday. She became well known in the world of ikebana, having studied it for over 25 years. All of this training leading her toward a career as a sculptor that began when she was 57 years old. Because she had spent her entire lifetime creating arrangements made of natural found objects, she gravitated toward the dumps made by humans, and there found all the materials for her sculpture. This is a detail of her piece called White Garden. which is made out of the metal siding of sheds. Notice how closely related her work is to quilts. This is her outside studio. And this was her inside studio. And I have to read to you what she has to say about studios. At the beginning, she was struggling to construct artworks in the confines of her family home. I was working on the dining room table. There was no room. Nobody could walk through the house. In 1983, largely at the instigation of her husband, a studio was built in the large courtyard adjoining the garden. But she says, my work got bigger. I needed an airplane hangar. You need height above your head because you use the air. I could do with 4 times the space. The crowded studio, shown here in 1996, reveals much about her work process. Most of her tools are basic hacksaw, hammer, and screwdriver. The space is packed with reminders of every stage of her career. Objects she stopped using in 1970s lie alongside materials she has only recently started to experiment with. As she picks her way through the maze, pieces regularly topple over with a resounding crash. Unmoved, she says, it's only the artwork falling over. You get used to it. I'm reading to you in the present tense as if she's still alive, but this catalog that I'm reading from came out almost at the same time that she died. Rosalie explains that her method of working involves living with her assemblages, gradually observing them and changing them until she feels they are right. She says, I keep everything out. I test things. They mostly don't get into the act, but you've got to try. If I don't keep them visible, they don't look at me. I put them out in the courtyard, then I alter them. About 3 hours is all I can do at a time. It's like walking around an art gallery. Your eyes get tired. Emotionally, it's draining. You put all of yourself into the work. I'm like that about work. Often I don't see anybody for days. You frighten everybody off after a while. I don't like other people involved, though I've got a helper who puts aluminum strips on the back of finished works. Sometimes he'll tidy me up and says, you ought to get steel-tipped boots to protect your feet. But as soon as I get this floor cleared, I start putting things down again. Sometimes I can't bear it myself. I don't even know what I've got. But if something is beautiful or interesting, I always take it. If there's a lot, I take a lot. It might be years before I use it. I think and I fester. Sometimes there's something in the back of your mind that you hadn't thought about. You got to look at things and be patient. Good enough is not good enough. You got to be right. You've got to learn to be your own critic. It's mirage country otherwise. Sometimes you do something and you're pleased with it and you come out the next day and say, nothing works. So it vanishes. And then something sets hard and you know for you only, you've got it. This piece by her is called Wood Ledger, and it's made out of wooden crates. She made it at age 75. Cat's eye, rainforest, all that jazz. These are made out of kitchen floor linoleum pieces that she found. Midsummer. Regeneration. Regeneration is about the bushfires that burned the gum trees, which somehow miraculously survive and begin to shoot out new sprouts. These are some shots of the burnt gum trees I took when I was in Australia a couple years ago after their great fires near Canberra. They're almost like lace, feathery lace branches. This is called Summer Swarm. It's a detail. It's made out of pieces of wood that she found. And look at it closely because it relates to an old antique Australian quilt from 1841. Some are divided, loopholes, full stretch, love apples. I want to read this final quote from her because for a time she was like the person I felt I could go to and feel like I had a mentor or a supporter. Art is about what religion's about, getting you airborne, getting you out of this box, which is life, into the expanding universe, which is what everybody wants. People say, oh, as long as you're happy, it keeps you off the streets. It doesn't. It's a passion. It drives you. You have to do it. That's the way I really see it. It takes everything you've got, every facet of yourself. You've got to keep it very honest, sharp. Otherwise, it's mirage country, and you've lost it. I think that what I do now is the sum total of all the things I used to do. Everything that's happened to me, everybody that's happened to me, makes me what I am today. And last, part 9 is called Crossroads. At the beginning of 2006, I wondered if I should just accept that I was old at age 62. Give up, sit in a rocking chair and talk the old talk. I was pretty depressed in a way, and I'm showing this quilt. I actually did 2 quilts during this period. I did very little work for a couple years, and the very fact that all of my lines are absolutely straight as like cut with a ruler gives you an idea of how little energy I felt. My mind kept asking the same questions over and over. Who am I? What do I want for myself? How can I become who I can be? Is it possible to create even better work? I woke early, this is from my sketchbook. I woke early this morning in an effort to unscramble all the hundreds of thoughts and notions swirling in my brain, a condition that seems to get more extreme with age. I find it exhilarating but sometimes frightening in all its intensity. All I think about are images. I am trying to unscramble ideas and thoughts about who I want to be and what I want for myself. I keep asking myself questions, trying to be as honest and thorough as possible. Questions such as, is it all about struggling to change, struggling to constantly dig deeper, struggling to keep believing one can dig deeper, struggling to be in touch with my true self, struggling to understand the constant anxiety, struggling to understand the volcano of anger inside, struggling to erupt or keep from erupting, struggling to examine my motives and resourcefulness. This is the second quilt during that period of time in which I made very few pieces. They're actually both quite large pieces. This one's 58 inches across and 96 inches tall. So I made the decision, the beginning of 2006, that yes, indeed, I had come to a crossroads. And the X represented the crossroads for me. This is a piece that I actually screen printed with a small screen over and over and over in simply black dye on white fabric. And in it I made small marks when I made the screen because I knew that I always liked making marks, but I hadn't really done it. And then I went back and I picked up an earlier construction piece that dated from 1991 in which I had played with the X. So I wrote out what the X meant to me. X is duplicitous. X can mean yes. X can mean no. X can mean a crossroad in one's life. X can close doors. Or X can close out doubt and allow doors to be opened. X has enormous energy and intent. X can be a line or a long, narrow shape. X can be configured over and over. X can be a crossroad in one's life and can lead to freedom. So with that in mind, I started working again in my studio. I made a ton of fabrics, what I call a strip of line sewn to a strip of shape, and I began making huge pieces again. Huge meaning, in this case, 83 inches across and 75 inches tall. All of this work done intuitively with absolutely no planning and going up and down a step ladder. So in other words, anytime that I pinned a piece on the wall, if it didn't work, if it wasn't placed correctly, I had to come down the ladder, stare at it from across my studio, go back up the ladder and repin it. And that's how this work was made. So through 2006 and 2007, I created 25 new works. Again, hand quilted, most of the work hand quilted by Marla Hadaball. Marla promised me at one time in her life, she's been working with me since 1988, so that's 20 years now. She said, I said to her, Marla, come on, you got to promise me you'll work with me till we're both 90. And she said, sure, I'll do it. And I have to say that when she worked on these large pieces for the first time ever, she said to me, I have to tell you that it's starting to hurt my shoulders because these big pieces were done in a quilting frame. And if you saw the back side, there are so many seams that she went through. This was the second one. I do want to just go back and tell you that the first one that I showed you, for the first time I gave subtitles because, as I said to you, I had gone through that period of feeling like I could never make another quilt. So this subtitle on the first one, before this one, was called Breaking Control. Remember I showed you the two quilts that were so tightly controlled. And this one I titled Anxiety. This one is construction's number 84, and I called it No. So underneath there is the X, which is trying to be controlling, and and then I took parts of all the rest of the X's and threw them on top. These big pieces were physically really hard for me to make. They were so heavy. By the time I was taking them up and down the ladder, pinning them to the wall, And I thought, man, Crow, you got to get in shape. You can't keep doing this unless you start getting in shape. I also started working with pink. I had always sort of stuck my nose up at pink, but I dyed a bunch of gaudy pinks, beautiful pinks, and they're in there. This is my studio to show you a work wall in my studio, and on the table in front are parts of those strips I sewed together of lines and shapes. Before I began to make all these big pieces, I cut and sewed fabric for 2 weeks, making what I call a fabric vocabulary, in order that I could pick intuitively whatever I felt like picking out of that bunch of fabrics. And believe me, it became a total rat's nest. So every now and then I'd have to stop and get them all lined up again. The piece that's on the wall is now finished, totally different looking from what's there. So anytime I start a new piece, because I work totally intuitively, it goes through a lot of changes. The other problem I have is, even though I have these beautiful, huge work walls, you can see on either side of this, I have pinned up so much stuff. I just think like everything is an idea, and as fast as I'm working, another ideas come into my head, and now I have to pin it up. And before I know it, I don't have any work wall left. But I'm afraid to take anything down because I'm afraid I'll forget my ideas. See, these are some smaller pieces. Constructions number 86.
What do you mean by smaller?
Smaller, I think they're about 40 inches across and maybe, 58 inches across and 40 inches tall. And this one's probably about 24 inches by 24 inches. Then after doing all those complex pieces, I pulled off and said, I got to work spare, and I'm going to work with this incredibly saturated orange, and I'm only going to throw in a few more colors, and I'm going to concentrate on spatial relationships. So these 3 quilts, they kind of flew at me. They weren't nearly, they just came, they just poured out. And I had them machine quilted by Kathleen Loomis in Kentucky, because by this time Marla couldn't keep up with how much I was making. I like the idea of taking a saturated color and flirting with almost becoming garish. After doing the machine piecing, I would pull off and work with fabrics that I had screen printed. So this one's here in the show, and it is about the Iraq War. Basically, the little shapes can either be seen as, I don't know if that's in focus, as dead people, bullets, or caskets. And the field of red is all the people who still to die. So this was a new series called Markings, in which I wanted to play with either printing on fabric, or in this case doing monoprints. And these were pretty much, most of them, except for that first one I just showed, about anxiety. In this case, Marla's quilting is not a grid, it follows the rhythm of the marks. And this was an attempt to control the anxiety by putting a grid over it. And then I started again working with my screen printed fabrics. Again, this was done with a small screen, and when it was placed on the fabric, I overlapped on purpose to make those little darker areas that you see. On the next one, I cut the fabric apart and I put in strips that I hand painted. And these pieces are large. I'm just going to make a guess, around 65 by 65 inches. This is a small hand-painted piece called Compromise. And then the last few are called Structures. And what you see are 3 complete prints of a huge screen that went selvage to selvage. I had to have help printing these, and I did this in a screen printing shop in Canberra, Australia. I basically paid to have the entire studio to myself with an assistant who helped me print my fabrics. And at home I have a stack of these fabrics that I'm going to be working on with throughout the next year, throughout this year and next. I'm going to just say this is to date the most expensive piece I sold. I sold this at my gallery in Philadelphia for $45,000 to a collector in New York City. And a second use of that same screen, but over-dyed this time with a gold dye, or a yellow, egg yellow dye. All right, I'm going to end. I'm just going to make a final statement. I know some of you want to run over to see the museum, so I'll try to hurry. I'm just going to say that it takes intense desire, clear vision, focus that at times must be a tunnel vision, focus excluding all else in your life. It takes absolute integrity. It takes discipline. It takes energy, enormous energy, to produce a body of work that begins to explore your perceptions, thoughts, and emotions, and which in turn become identified with you. Thank you.